The lecture is being live broadcast on the GSE's YouTube channel, so the recording will be archived and accessible there. So while the camera and microphone are oriented towards the speaker, any audience contributions or questions may be captured on the broadcast and recorded. Okay? So it is my pleasure to introduce Judith Kafka, who is a professor in the School of Public Affairs at Baruch College at CUNY, New York City. I got to know Judith over the last year and a half, 2 years. I'm co-editing the Handbook of Research on Teaching, which is AERA's major publication on research on teaching. And so we recruited major scholars in the country to write chapters on significant areas in education. And one of the chapters is on the history of teaching, and we were looking for someone with fresh ideas who could take on an enormous intellectual task, and we were trying to avoid always going to old people like me and older. So we decided, we did a comprehensive search. We talked to lots of folks in the field, and we picked Judith, and we couldn't be more thrilled. She's been working on a draft. It's just an outstanding piece of scholarship, and we're hoping it will be out next year, so you'll be able to see that. So, so I invited Judith to come give a talk here because I thought her work would be very interesting. And so she's worked in urban education in the post-war America over the, with a historical lens, and she has looked at how policies sort of either support the status quo of inequality in our system, or can actually do something to policies that can be positive forces in that. She has a very interesting background. She's been a teacher of French in Louisiana middle schools. She's also taught English at San Quentin Prison. So it is my pleasure to introduce Judith, and have at it.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Drew. I'm just going to sit a little timer aside. This is what I'm doing. Thank you so much, Drew, for inviting me to be here today, and thank you to all of you for coming. I was telling Drew before that I think the last time I spoke for sort of 40 minutes straight was probably at my own job talk about 10 years ago. So if I may stop and try to get some interaction going, because I don't teach by lecturing for 45 minutes. But the title of and please feel free, if I say something that you're not sure what I meant or you have a question, feel free to raise your hand. We'll do questions at the end, but we don't need to save questions for at the end. So my talk that I titled for today is called Zero Tolerance Discipline and the Centralization of Educational Authority, or Why Don't Teachers Make the Rules Anymore? It is based on my book, out in paperback in a couple weeks, about the history of zero tolerance in American public schooling. And it is about discipline policy, but it's also about larger issues of centralization of authority. So why don't teachers make the rules anymore about discipline, but about all sorts of other things, right? So there's parallels in discipline. This came first, zero tolerance came first, but now we've got No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top, Common Core, all sorts of other things where the decisions are not being made in the classroom by teachers. And I also told Drew that since I knew most of the audience was going to be graduate students, that I talked to you a little bit about my process, because my book was first a dissertation, and before it was a dissertation, it was a pre-qualifying paper, and before it was a pre-qualifying paper, it was just a regular old paper in a regular old class. So I think that when I was a student, I always found it useful to find out how researchers sort of move forward with their work, right? And how do you know when you've got a topic you want to follow, and what kind of changes you make along the way? Okay, so as Drew mentioned, I taught in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I taught there for 3 years in the mid-'90s, late 90s. And maybe my last year, I'm trying to picture the classroom I was in. Yes, my last year of teaching, the district of Baton Rouge Parish adopted a zero-tolerance discipline policy. And what that meant in Baton Rouge, and what it meant in most places that did this, was that students who were found in possession on campus of an illegal drug or a weapon of any kind were immediately suspended and moved for expulsion. And in Louisiana, not like New Jersey and New York and some other states, students don't have the same kinds of rights or recognitions of the same sort of educational rights that they have in the Northeast, for example. And so what that mostly meant, almost exclusively meant, certainly for my students who were all poor and black, was that if you're suspended for school, well, there might be an alternative site for you to go to. There's no transportation for you to get there. So that basically means you're not going to school. If you're expelled from school, that's pretty much it for you, right? There might be an alternative site that you, in theory, could go to. But again, you're pretty much done with school, right? So this was middle school students, and that was going to be it for them, right? I don't have to tell you what it means for a poor black person who has not even finished middle school, let alone high school, let alone college, right? So their economic opportunities, their social opportunities, their life chances were pretty much cut off right there. In addition, any fight involving a child of 15 years or over would be arrested. The police would be called and they'd be arrested, right? So what this meant in a middle school, they'd fight with a 12-year-old and a 15-year-old. The 15-year-old gets cuffed and put in the police car, 12-year-old doesn't. So what I saw was, in many cases, students who were really good students, who had been classroom leaders, who were involved in the classroom. In some cases were really motivated. In some cases were really strong readers. In other cases came out of super tough backgrounds, were falling in this zero tolerance policy, and their educational opportunity was done. And so when I went to graduate school, this was kind of in the back of my head. Why would people do this? Why would people think that this was a good idea, right? What was sort of the thought process behind people that would say, oh yeah, let's do this. Let's expel and suspend kids, regardless of extenuating circumstances. Let's not ask teachers what they think of the kids, or if there be any argument for keeping them in school. We're just going to make sure that they're eliminated from school and eliminated from basically any kind of opportunity moving forward. That was really driving my question. And I had I was trained as a historian as an undergrad, but I went to a policy program. I was not intending to focus on history, as I ended up doing. But we had a history class that was required in my program, and I decided to look at the history of zero tolerance policies and see if I could figure out sort of where these came from. And what I found out in sort of my preliminary research is that back in the olden days, and really not that long ago, right, just going back a few decades ago, school discipline was controlled at the school site. It was a decision of teachers and principals. And there's a doctrine that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, especially at the higher education level, in loco parentis. It means that teachers and educators act in place of the parent when children are under their charge, both legally and morally, right? So from a disciplinary standpoint, that meant that teachers would discipline children in their classrooms in the same way that they would expect, not necessarily the same way parents would, but the same way they would expect parents to discipline the children in the home, right? And that you would make tough disciplinary decisions in the best interest of the child, right? And that sometimes parents would complain, and they would say things like, you're being unfair, I don't want you to hit my kid. For the most part, teachers in schools always won out because of in loco parentis. And I don't want to romanticize this, right? Because teachers could be authoritarian, and children were beaten in school, and there are all sorts of problems. But it was the teacher and the principal's decision. And there was, except for sort of egregious cases, there was very little external accountability in that, right? So teachers had a lot of authority. Today, discipline is controlled almost exclusively at the district, state, and federal level, right? So yes, teachers make day-to-day decisions in their classrooms, but in terms of what behaviors are punishable and what aren't, what the list of potential punishments are, those are all contained. If those of you who have taught probably in your district, there was a list of students' obligations and rights and teachers' obligations and rights. You got a handbook, right? Maybe it was this big, maybe it was that big, right? Of all the different regulations from your district office, from your state office, and now today from federal law. And I had a link here to New York City's Chancellor's Regs, but we don't need to look at that now. So my question really was why? Why did this happen? What was the history that led to this really radical shift in just a few decades? Usually in history and in education, but in other kinds of contexts also, we think of bureaucratic expansion as coming from the top down, right? And just when I say bureaucracy, what do you all think of with bureaucracy? Because I want to have sort of a general sociological definition of bureaucracy. What does bureaucracy mean?
Lots of levels of government, lots of levels of supervision.
Right, lots of levels of supervision, and key to the notion of bureaucracy is that there's a centralized place where decisions are being made and they're sent down through the chains, right? So people up here make the decisions and they tell other people what to do, right? And then Lipsky had in the 60s this idea of sort of the street level bureaucrats, the people down here who are actually enacting the decisions, and they might make some changes, right? Part of his argument was that what you actually do on the ground is different from what they're telling you to do up here. But still, in a bureaucratic organization, we have the centralized decision making and it's coming down, right? And then there's another core component to bureaucracy, which is really important for schools. Anyone? Bueller. That's the specialization of tasks, right? So schools, we used to have one classroom, one teacher, did everything, taught all grades, taught all subjects, pumped water, cut firewood, all that stuff, right? Now we have custodians who clean, we have psychologists who deal with mental issues, we have guidance, teachers are assigned specific discipline areas, specific grades, so we specialize tasks. And those are the two core functions, sort of the two main characteristics that define bureaucracy. And they're really important for understanding discipline because well, we used to have teachers and then later principals who made these decisions. We're centralizing who gets to make the decisions, but we've also specialized who actually does the discipline. We'll talk about in a little bit. So anyway, okay, so the main story that we usually have from bureaucracy in education is that it happened top down and that historically in the United States, it was elites, people at the top, sort of imposing their will on teachers and communities. So we used to have schools that were independent, that existed in towns and kind of did their own thing. And through the decades, we had bureaucracy, levels of bureaucracy imposed upon them, right? That teachers all of a sudden were having their autonomy limited. That community members were all of a sudden being told at the state level, this is how you're going to operate these schools. I put a couple of citations down. Probably many of you are familiar with David Tyak's work. Marjorie Murphy wrote on the unions, which you might be interested in today because she looks at the history of unionism, which is changing right before our eyes in places like New Jersey. But both of their stories, they have different starting points. But again, we have bureaucracy created from the top down. And what I found, I guess I should go back. What I found in the case of discipline really challenges this, right? What I find, what I'll share with you in a little bit, is that in fact, when it came to discipline, it was not imposed from the top down. Federal laws for zero tolerance policies are the last step in the centralization of disciplinary authority that happened locally and kept going up and up and up. So that's my story. That's my groundbreaking story I'm going to share with you today. When I started looking way back my first year of graduate school at sort of what do people say about this idea that why do we even have, a district level discipline policy? Those didn't used to exist, right? So where did they come from? Why do we all of a sudden have rules that every teacher is supposed to follow in the district? And I found sort of two general explanations. There's a lot of explanations sort of in popular press, but in terms of academics or researchers even addressing this issue was almost no one, right? But there was a little bit around, and these were the two main explanations. The first one, which is very popular with conservatives sort of in sort of social commentary stuff, but also you get a couple scholars, and Richard Arum I wouldn't characterize as conservative, but the argument is that we have these court rulings. I know you all familiar with that, right? So Tinker v. Des Moines, this idea that students have some core central constitutional rights that they do not check at the schoolhouse door, that they continue to have with them as students. And the argument is that once you start giving students these constitutional rights, then you can't do in loco parentis anymore. Teachers can't act like parents anymore because they're forced by the Supreme Court to view students as almost adults with these constitutional rights. And so they had to develop centralized policies because what else could schools do? Teachers had been, could no longer act as parents. So that's one argument. That's sort of the Supreme Court's fault, the students' rights movement in general, which pushed students to be treated like adults. And once you're going to start treating them like adults, you have to have centralized rules that you can enforce upon them. The other argument, so this puts this change in the late 60s. The other argument is that students just started being really, really bad in the 60s, right? There were protests, there was violence, there was a lot of racial conflict, and that students didn't want to defer to teachers' authority in the way that they used to. And because students refused to defer to teachers' authority in the way that they used to, schools and districts were required to come up with strict rules and policies and bring police in and do all sorts of stuff to gain control back over the schools. And this, again, puts it in about the 60s. And I put a couple citations down there in case you all are interested. Some of you might know Pedro Noguera's name. John Devine is a little bit less familiar, but he did a pretty intense study. None of these are historians, I want to point out. So this has not been a question that historians have looked at deeply. It tends to be sociologists who might try to look back a couple decades and kind of guess. I'm saying that on YouTube. But guess a little bit, right? Because they hadn't looked deeply into historical records. But these seemed like compelling arguments to me when I was starting out, and they put the time period in about the 60s. So the first paper I did on this topic, I looked at what was happening in Detroit and in Louisville, Kentucky. They sound random, but they both had legal cases that involved discipline. So it allowed me, I went to University of California, Berkeley, it allowed me in California, I could access these court documents, right, without going into any archives. And I could read and I could get their newspapers and I could see these battles around the centralized discipline policies in the context of desegregation. Louisville and Detroit had two pretty different stories. And I thought it was really interesting. Although I started realizing that this wasn't new in the 60s. There were enough references to centralized discipline policies in other cities that I realized that other locations had them earlier. So I knew my time period was a little off. So I knew that this story was partly right, but not totally right. At the time that I was, so at the time I was as I said, I was in California, and I started conducting this research, and I started getting more and more intrigued and more interested in it. And I was fortunate to have a number of advisors, and most of them weren't too excited with me working on discipline. I went to grad school right in the late 90s, early 2000s. No Child Left Behind is just getting past, state-led accountability. People are really into test scores. Value-added models are just getting off the ground in graduate schools, and the idea that I would look at behavior seemed very low level, right, to a lot of my advisors who are wonderful people. This wasn't really about academic achievement, right, and everything was supposed to be about academic achievement. But my primary advisor, who was also a historian of education, said, yeah, go with it, because actually this is where it's all at, right? The relationship between teachers and students and teachers and communities around student behavior and how we treat students undergirds all the other stuff that's going on, right? Plus, this stuff really matters to teachers, right? Those of you who are former teachers in the room, you know. We care a lot about discipline, right? And even in our high-achieving schools, we care about discipline, because it has a lot to say with how we're going to conduct ourselves and how we're going to interact. So I was fortunate to get approval on the topic. I started digging around more, and I realized that two contrasting cities, neither of which were anywhere near where I was living, would not be a fast dissertation. And I had a partner who was ready for us to figure out where we'd be living and didn't want me to take 5 or 6 years to do my dissertation. So I ended up working with Los Angeles Unified School District, which at the time my research starts, it was actually called Los Angeles City School District. It was a really great case for me because I could fly down, it wasn't too far away, it was easier for me to get funding, and it turned out that because it's a really interesting mixed race story, I was able to get funding from a couple of different stories to help pay for my research down there. No one had done a history of the Los Angeles City Schools since the progressive era, which actually was good and bad. It was good in that this was all new research. It was bad in that there was no book for me to look at that could already tell me what had happened in Los Angeles. But it's a really exciting district that more people should look at. It's the second largest in the nation. The only one bigger than it is New York City. It's the largest physically in the nation. It's an enormous district. It's in a weird way that they did their own history. It's both urban and suburban. So you've got what you think of as Los Angeles City, but you've got areas that are not part of the city of Los Angeles. And so, but that the way that they're district unified, you've got truly suburban neighborhoods that are still part of the district. So you've got all these really interesting contrasts right in the same area. Also, for the post-war era, it was multiracial before most major cities in the U.S. were. So even starting in the 1950s, there's a significant Mexican-American population as well as African-American as well as white. And so that was sort of the way the country's gone, that this was kind of, they were kind of at the forefront of that. You have this really interesting rural migration in the post-war era coming into Los Angeles that's different from the kind of post-war migration you get in places here. We have a lot of history about what happened in New York and New Jersey and Chicago and Detroit. The West has been really under-researched in terms of what and their post-war history and their de-industrialization history is really different from ours here. So it was a really interesting case to study for that reason, and so that's what I ended up doing my dissertation on, which ultimately became my book. And what I found when I dug really deep into this story, and I went into the archives, and I looked at school board minutes, and I looked at letters to boards of education, I looked at boards of education's letters to each other, and I looked at the local ethnic newspapers, was that, in fact, the centralization of discipline in Los Angeles, but in a lot of other places, was actually a bottom-up story. It did not start with people up above saying, we want to give you rules to follow. It started with teachers and then students and community members, and then finally administrators saying, we need centralized rules. We need rules that cut across schools, that cut across even districts, that say what teachers can, what students can and can't do, and what teachers and principals can and can't do when students don't do what they're supposed to do. So, and that to me is an intriguing story that goes beyond just discipline. I think we'll find a lot of parallels to that actually in what's happened today at the federal level. So I started out looking in the 1950s because that's when the Los Angeles City School District adopted one of, if not, I want to say it was the very first district-wide discipline policy in the country, but I haven't checked every other district in the country, so I don't know. It was treated that way. The way I found out about it was from a story in the New York Times. So it got national coverage when it happened at the time. This was a really big deal, that a district would develop a discipline policy. It was a really big deal. So teachers actually asked for it. They started asking for it in the late 1950s. And the question is why? Why would teachers want a policy that, at least theoretically, would limit their autonomy? Why would they want a policy above them? Teachers are supposed to want control of the classroom, right? Teachers are supposed to want to shut the door, and they know what to do, and do it, and have everybody else leave them alone. That's what we always hear about, right? Teachers want more control, not less control. Well, they had a couple of arguments why they wanted a centralized discipline policy. Let's see how I'm doing in time here. Their first argument was that having a centralized discipline policy would create order in a growing and diverse district. And I should say in context, for those of you whose history is a little weak, in the 1950s there was a huge juvenile delinquency scare. There was the belief that that young people were sort of this awful generation that were going to ruin the country, that both in the cities but in the suburbs, there was this book called split level, there's this phenomenon called split level delinquency, that kids would move out to the suburbs and they were so alienated and bored that they would just become delinquents. Think James Dean, Blackboard Jungle, if y'all haven't seen that film, it's fabulous, but it takes place in a city, but it's multi-ethnic. Most of the students are ethnic whites, and they beat up their teachers, they tried to rape a teacher, they're super tough. The movie got banned in a lot of cities because there's some rock and roll music in the beginning. But this is what was happening in the 1950s. So discipline was on the radar. People were worried about student behavior. They were worried about youth. They were sure that this, that the nation was, you think the 1950s, you think, poodle skirts, but in fact there was this whole underlying current of fear, right? Adult fear that they impose on children. Historically, that's what happens in any age of anxiety. But so the teacher said, we think that a discipline policy will create order. The Los Angeles City School District was growing at about a rate of about 20% a year. So it's getting massively bigger every year. There's a teacher shortage, there's space shortage. They're recruiting teachers from other states to come teach in Los Angeles. And the teachers say, look, we've got people coming from all over the country. They don't know how to behave. They don't know how to behave in Los Angeles schools, as if Los Angeles had these special behavioral norms, right, that didn't exist in other schools. The students don't know how to behave. Their parents don't know what's expected of them, right? That was a ding on the parents. And these teachers coming in don't even know what's expected. So if we can have some standards, right, recognize that? If we can have some standards so that these people from rural Mississippi and rural Louisiana know how to behave in our cosmopolitan Los Angeles, that's really going to help everybody out, right? And this is a little bit of race story, but it's actually not that much of a race story because most of the, a lot of the criticism was for the families moving to the valley, and the valley was very white. So this was really a knock against these sort of white rural families who were coming from, podunk and didn't know how to behave in really cool Los Angeles. And the argument was that standardization would solve discipline problems. So that was one argument that teachers made. Another argument they made was that it was an issue of justice, right, and equity, and that how can it be fair, how can it be just that children in one neighborhood have one set of rules to follow, and children in another neighborhood have another set of rules to follow. And surely if Congress can make laws that apply to all the country, then we here in Los Angeles can come up with some school discipline rules that apply to all children, right? This was an argument that was especially put forth by some of the union representatives. Los Angeles, like most of the country at the time, teachers did not have the right to collectively bargain. The unions were very, very weak, so they were a symbolic organization with no power. But this was also during the Cold War, so there was a lot of comparisons between Los Angeles and communist Russia, and they had, right, so we are the United States is a land where we are ruled by law, not by men, right? So we shouldn't have this we shouldn't allow teachers to be these authoritarian leaders, we should hold them accountable to a uniform set of rules and regulations. So that was another argument. The last argument they offered, which I think was really the main thing they were getting at, although they weren't always explicit about it, was that they said it would strengthen their authority, right? So how would centralized rules that were not their own rules, why would those strengthen their authority? Seems a little counterintuitive. They want someone else to make rules that they're supposed to follow, and in doing so, they're going to have more authority. Any ideas why that would give them more authority?
They're almost like purveying it themselves because it's coming from top, but then they're the purveyors of those rules.
Okay, so they can say, look, it comes from above me, right? Yeah, that's exactly right. So they want to be able to say, hey, it's not just me. I've got this written down here, right? That's part of their argument. If parents no longer want to listen to just me, but if I've got a rule that I can point to, I've got some legitimacy there, right? So they actually want the bureaucracy to strengthen them. Right, that's part of it. They think that the bureaucracy is going to give them more legitimacy, right? So this is before court cases, and this is before student protests saying that, oh, kids just don't want to listen to these teachers. These are teachers in the 1950s saying, I don't think that people are going to listen to me just because I'm me, just because I'm a teacher. Actually, something else backing me up, right? And there's another reason why they think this is going to strengthen their authority that has to do more with the internal politics of schools. Any former teachers want to make a guess about that one? If you're a teacher and you're not a fan of your principal, how do you think having a policy might make you feel better?
So the students wouldn't blame the teacher, they could blame the principal. It's the principal's rule, not mine.
Okay, that's part of it. Although remember, it's actually going to be a district rule. They want a full district rule. But that is part of it. Any other ideas? You all must have loved your principals. The idea here is that if as a teacher, you don't think your principal is backing you up, right? And this continues to be one of the top complaints teachers have when they leave schools, that their principals did not back them up on discipline. It continues to be one of the #1 reason teachers give for leaving teaching. You can have a rule and you can say, hey, principal, you can't ignore what this kid is doing. Look, right here. It says they're not allowed to do it, and it says what you have to do, right? It also lets them say, look, principal, right here, this is what I'm supposed to do. Right here, this is what you're supposed to do, okay? This was before union contracts, so this is before what we would call sort of codification of jobs and responsibilities, right? At this time, this is not far after the McCarthyism and teachers are being fired just for being accused of being red, right? So this is a way, it's almost like a job protection. I've got my list of responsibilities, and you've got yours. I'm going to do what I'm supposed to do, and you're going to do what you're supposed to do. So it's a formalization of teachers' authority, again, in the bureaucracy. Well, this is teachers saying, they don't, of course, give speeches saying, we love bureaucracy, we want bureaucracy. But in fact, they kind of do, right? They would never say they don't want autonomy and they don't want discretion, but they want the strength of organization behind them. They want the district to support them, and they want what they're supposed to do be written down, right? Which is not the usual line we get about teachers. We usually hear that they want freedom to do what it is that they think is in the best interest of their children. You don't hear that language here, although they do say that it will be good for the students who are supposed to be, behaving and are being hurt by kids who are misbehaving. I'm not going to talk about this in the talk today because I don't have time to do my entire book in a 45-minute talk. But at the same time that they're asking for centralized policies, they're also asking for more special classrooms and special schools for the misbehaving kids. So at the same time they want centralized policies, which I said, remember, was one core idea of bureaucracy, they also wanted specialization of responsibility. So they'll handle regular discipline problems, but the really misbehaving kids, they need specialized attention by a specialized teacher, specialized staff. And they say things like, we cannot bear the burden of discipline when we're trying to teach. We have been trained as educators. We have not been trained as parole officers, right? That's not our job. This is a familiar argument that we still hear today, right? So discipline problems need to go elsewhere. They should not be the responsibility of classroom teachers. We have professional responsibility, and dealing with discipline problems isn't one of them. So they're really fighting to get the misbehaving kids out of the classroom, which I was a teacher, you can totally understand why you'd want the kid who's always yelling or misbehaving out, right? So you can teach the other 27, whatever your class size is. But again, I'm just pointing out here that this is a bottom-up story. This is teachers demanding this. They do get more specialized build. This is the 50s. Everyone loves their schools. Everyone keeps raising taxes. They get more buildings built. They get more specialized classrooms built. They get money in for more specialized teachers. They get money in to build these new special buildings for the misbehaving kids, and they get their centralized policy. The policy they end up with in 1959, when it's finally passed and enacted, is very, 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 very vague. It says things like students will respect teachers. Teachers will maintain order in the classroom. You can imagine, right? The only things they have in there that are specific are things that are already state law, like you're not allowed to set off firecrackers in the school, right? Things that are not even really they're sort of beyond what the teachers were. They already existed in state law. So it is truly a symbolic policy, right? But as I said, it receives national attention. It's a really big deal. When the school board passes it, one of the members of the school board says it is the most important school reform to happen in the United States in the past 20 years. And this seems silly to us now because we know what discipline policies can look like. But this was the first discipline policy that the nation recognized existing at a district level, and it really was sort of in the concept of, who governs schools and children. It was a little bit revolutionary, right? Even though it was only symbolic, it changed the levels of authority. Now we've got this policy that really doesn't say much, but it's there. And I argue that was sort of the beginning, right? Even though it's vague, it's a policy, and teachers complained after it was implemented. It doesn't change anything. And some of them even said, after you put the rules down in black and white, it's even worse, because now the students can see what's there and what's not there, right? But they did not say, you know what, let's get rid of the policy. We liked it better when we had total control. That's not what they say. They just keep asking. And the other thing they didn't like is they felt that the policy strengthened principals' position without strengthening teachers' position, right? So they resented that as well. But again, they didn't say, let's just go back to us having more autonomy. They said, we want stricter rules. We want a stronger policy. And that's going to be the theme throughout this history. Okay, so that happened in the late 50s. In the 1960s in Los Angeles, as in much of the country, including quite a bit here in New Jersey, right, there was a big student rights movement, protest movement, civil rights movement, a lot of stuff going on in schools. In Los Angeles, you had Watts in 1965. But it wasn't until a couple of years later that you started having student protests. And in the context of these student protests, students start demanding centralization of disciplinary authority. They have a very different reason from the reason teachers have, but they end up with a really similar result. So in the 1960s in Los Angeles, there are a set of protests and walkouts and boycotts and sit-ins for a host of reasons. The most famous one was in 1968, and it's often called the school blowouts, and it was led, and it was conducted primarily initially by Mexican-American youth. And then a lot of their families kind of followed them into the boycott. But ultimately, about 10,000 students participated, including African American and white students, and it was a pretty big deal. But there were a lot of other protests also. And with these protests had a number of things in common. And they weren't just about discipline. They were not predominantly about discipline. They were predominantly about equal rights. They were predominantly about more equitable distribution of resources. Los Angeles was increasingly racially diverse and increasingly segregated school system during this time. They wanted more recognition of Mexican-American and African-American culture. They wanted more African-American principals and more Spanish-speaking teachers. But in the process of doing these, they also had some discipline-related demands. For one thing that happened in a series of walkouts was demanding the replacement of an unpopular, exclusively white principal, exclusively male principal. Sometimes they got the principal booted, sometimes they didn't. But in the process, they were appealing to a higher authority, right? The principal's supposed to be king at this point. This was almost exclusively men at the higher levels, sort of king of his high school. And yet students were going above him and saying, get rid of him. We can't stand him. And often succeeding, not always. Sometimes he would resign. Sometimes he would get, sort of horizontally transferred. But students were starting to see that centralized authority as the place they could go to when they wanted to question the authority at the local level. Right? So again, they're saying, well, the authority doesn't necessarily reside here in the school building. The building is one part of a larger building, say, and we don't like what you're saying here, we're going to go above. A lot of times, the arguments, the things that they didn't like about their principal were discipline related. Unfair discipline, canceling dances arbitrarily, locking the bathrooms during class time, things that might sound sort of silly to us, but of course the students matter quite a bit, right? And locking the bathroom would be very uncomfortable. One of the big protests started because a principal wouldn't let a student participate in the graduation ceremony because she hadn't fulfilled all her credits. So often they were sort of small things or what would seem like small things from a policy perspective, but they would start this sort of eruption of challenging this unpopular principle. One thing that happened in the huge blowouts, you had, again, over 10,000 students who walked out of school, who didn't participate in school for days. And many of their teachers said, as they were walking out the door, you can't do this. You will be suspended. You might be expelled. You can't just walk out of school. You can't choose not to attend school. Well, as part of their negotiation with the district, they said, we want clemency. They want amnesty. We want to make sure that no one gets expelled or suspended for participating in this walkout. And the board said, okay. Teachers were not happy. Some teachers were supportive, okay? Not all teachers are the same. There were some teachers who were very supportive of the student walkouts. There were some teachers who participated in the student walkouts. But in general, teachers were very angry that the district had granted clemency. And they wrote letters saying things like, now a student can walk into class and say, ha ha, I can walk out of class and you can't do anything about it. And the student will be right. You've taken away our authority. We're supposed to decide if students are going to be suspended for behavior in our school, and you've now said we can't suspend them for this thing they did. They walked right out. They walked right by me. Right? They're supposed to listen to me, and instead they didn't. Teachers were very angry. Teachers in schools that were not affected at all, West Hollywood, white, wealthy districts or schools, wrote letters saying, you've undermined our authority. Yeah, we didn't have any students walk out, but you've let them know that our say is not the final say. You've let them know that you, at the school board, are going to make discipline decisions. The other thing that students demanded, which they ultimately got, was uniformity in some school regulations, including dress codes and corporal punishment. At the time, corporal punishment was legal, but the students complained it was only used in black and brown schools. There's some evidence to support this. We don't really know for sure because we didn't collect data as a country on discipline in that time period. Also, dress codes. Turned out that in a lot of the white schools, boys could have long hair, boys could have facial hair, girls could wear pants. But turned out in East Los Angeles, Mexican American, boys were not allowed to have long hair or facial hair, and girls weren't supposed to wear pants. And they didn't say we want to get rid of dress codes. They said we want there to be the same process at every school, how dress codes are established. Turned out in the white schools, kids got to participate in the process. And the Mexican American schools, which are run by white teachers and white principals, students did not have a say in the process. So they had and again, they were going to the district and saying, we want you to decide, not our principal, about how you do dress code, okay? So, so these are just some of the demands that they had that pushed discipline decision-making from the school site to the district. And they got some of their demands, they didn't get all of their demands. But what they did end up with, so some of the demands that they did get, like the district decided to get rid of all dress and grooming codes. That's partly because of the Supreme Court decision, but not only because of it. But they did grant students clemency. They did remove some principals. They did promise to prioritize putting black principals in some schools in South Central Los Angeles. All these things, as I said, really angered teachers who felt that their authority was being undermined. But teachers did not say, let's stop giving the centralized district disciplinary control. Give it back to us. No, right? That's not what teachers said. The teacher said is, we want more tougher rules. We want stricter rules. We want to really punish these kids. We want it written down in black and white that they're not allowed to conduct sit-ins, that they're not allowed to walk out. And we want to make sure that you expel and suspend kids who do this kind of stuff. So that was, so students are pushing to go above schools, and now teachers are pushing to move them up there, to meet them up there, and even go higher, right? And even have stricter rules against students. So by the end of the 1960s, you start getting stricter discipline policies and more rules and regulations about minutia coming down from the district level. The district does start listing which student organizations can be banned by principals, right? So backup principals then who say, UMass, no, you can't operate here, right? Black Power student group, no, you can't operate here. I've got a list of organizations that I can eliminate or that I can say can't meet on campus, and this is one of them, right? So they do start using the district to enact stricter rules. So that gets us through the 1960s. In the early 1970s, we start seeing in Los Angeles exactly what becomes sort of zero tolerance policies in the 80s and 90s across the country. And in this case, it's principals. Now we've got principals in the 1970s saying, we want strict rules. We're supporting strict rules that are created by district leaders that really limit principals' discretion. The biggest one was in, I have my year wrong, I think 1971, this district passed a rule mandating suspension and expulsion for students found in possession of a weapon on school campuses. This doesn't sound radical to us now, right? Because we're used to this. This has been policy for all of us since 1994. But at the time, the idea that principals could not utilize discretion and couldn't try to take into consideration who is the student, why does he, again, almost exclusively he, why does he have a gun with him, or why does he have a knife with him, what's going on, right? Principals would often mandate family counseling or some kind of after-school club or all sorts of things that you could imagine a principal doing when a student is found to have a weapon on campus. This took that option off the table, right? This was the sort of, I can't do anything about it. You're not allowed to have a knife on campus. If you have a knife on campus, regardless of what's going on in your life, regardless of who you are, regardless of what I think is in your best interest, regardless of the commute you have coming to school, right? This is 1970s Los Angeles, pretty dangerous place in a lot of these neighborhoods. None of that is relevant. According to district rules, I'm going to suspend you immediately and move to expel you. There's not a record of a single principal arguing this policy, arguing against it. And in fact, it was pretty popular in general. Teachers supported it. There was a student leadership organization, and there was one member of a student leadership organization who was from the Black Caucus, and he said he was worried that this was going to lead to unequal results, that certain neighborhoods would feel the brunt of this policy, and that he worried that it was no longer, that it meant that schools were no longer taking responsibility for the conditions that led kids to go to school with weapons, right? And of course, he knew exactly what he was talking about, because within 2 years of this policy being passed, the suspension and expulsion rates in black schools shot up, right? Because that's where most of the weapons are being found. So it's a uniform policy, it applies to everyone, but the problem exists mostly in South Central Los Angeles at this point. That's where most of the school violence is happening, and that's who bears the brunt of the policy, right? So he knew it was going to happen, as did anyone else, right? He goes on record saying he's concerned about it. No one else seems to be concerned about it. A couple years later, this is actually a really good story, I won't go into too great of detail, but a couple years later, about 200 students, almost all of whom were white, get arrested by undercover cops for being drug pushers in the terminology. They supposedly were selling all kinds of drugs throughout Los Angeles, but the cops could only somehow were only able to purchase marijuana. And they were not able to purchase any drugs in any black schools or in any Mexican-American schools. So they don't talk about who these undercover cops were. I don't know if they were sending white cops into South Central or what happened, but they only were able to buy drugs in the white schools. So they end up arresting about 200 kids who all end up in school the next day. Their parents go down to court, go down to the jail, get their bail, they go back to school the next day. People are livid, drug pushers back in our schools, right? Now, as you can imagine, the evidence on some of these kids isn't stellar, okay? The cops were in these schools for 6 months. They were only able to purchase a small amount of marijuana, but they were able to arrest all these 200 kids. The district says, all right, we're going to expel them immediately. So the district expels all 200 kids. But that's a lot of kids to expel, right? And there's been no trial. Now, this is before we now have a Supreme Court decision that says you need due process, although those of you who are teachers know that due process works sort of in different ways in different districts. But at this point, there's no right for due process, right? So instead of a principal saying, I think it's likely you have been selling drugs, and I'm going to go ahead and suspend you until your case goes through, or I think this must be a case of mistaken identity, or whatever it is, the district decides all these kids are expelled. And the ACLU actually represents these kids and tries to get them reinstated. They lose their case. It ends up getting overturned much later when they're adults, right after the Supreme Court decides they have the right to due process. But again, this is the case of the district making a decision over the heads of principals, and principals not minding. And in many cases saying, thank you, I need the support. I want the support. The other thing I don't want to go into too long a detail because I'm already at 40 minutes is they keep begging for more cops in the schools. They already have sort of armed security, but they want more and more police, not just in the schools, but they want the police to be more proactive in taking kids away and locking them up for longer periods of time. Okay? So they say, you get these kids, you arrest them, 6 months later, they're back in our schools. Can't you keep them longer? Right? Can't you keep them out of our schools longer? So this increases that specialization. These kids, these criminals, should not be our responsibility. They're not for us. They're for the juvenile justice system. We want the juvenile justice system to do its job so we can do our job. Okay, that's a whole other set of arguments they have. So again, in my larger thing about people pushing bureaucracy from the bottom up, you've got teachers, you've got students, you've got principals saying, hello, people up here and people over here, you need to start doing this for us. You need to start being in charge of this job. And so by the late 70s, you've got high student suspension expulsion rates. You've got a racial discipline gap on the rise, right? So during this period, you've got roughly, it varies a little bit, in the beginning of, in the mid-1960s, you've got about 20% of the student population is black, about 20% is Mexican American, about 56% is white, and the rest is Asian American. But the expulsion and suspension rates are going up, except for that blip when they expelled those 200 white kids for selling drugs. It's pretty much just in the black schools and increasingly in East LA in the Mexican American schools. And you've got teacher and principal disciplinary discretion on the decline, right? So more and more rules are being, more and more disciplinary actions are being determined above them. So that's what's happening in the late 1970s, which is pretty much what we've got now. What happened in LA is pretty much what happened nationally. In 1983, I'm sure you all are familiar with the report, The Nation at Risk, which was from the committee that Reagan put together, and the Reagan administration, that talked about all the reasons why our schools were so bad. This doesn't get a lot of play, but one of the things they listed in their report was discipline, and that teachers were overburdened by misbehaving students, that they needed more support. Okay, and they recommended that states, among all the other things that you learned about, like raising credentialing requirements and increasing requirements to graduate from high school and have more school days, they also said that states should pass laws easing the disciplinary burden for teachers. And California in 1983 was the very first state to pass new legislation after Nation at Risk, and lo and behold, they passed a state-level law mandating student suspension and expulsion for drug possession and for weapons, and also for other stuff like insubordination, right? Which is what some of you probably worked in districts where you could get suspended and expelled, not just for drugs and guns, but also for things like being insubordinate, right, or being overly aggressive. In 1994, that's when we finally get to the federal law. And the feds had tried before that. Reagan tried to pass some discipline-related laws. Reagan, the same one who wanted to get rid of the Department of Education, still wanted to pass laws about discipline in schools, right? The first George Bush got a law passed, but it was overruled as being unconstitutional. Clinton was the one who got it through. In 1994, the Gun-Free Schools Act, which is sort of what a lot of people will tell you is when zero tolerance policy started, is 1994, but that's the federal level, right? And what I'm saying is that's the very last stage in the centralization process. And I actually think that you'll see a lot of parallels if you look at sort of the history of No Child Left Behind and where those ideas came from, right? They ended up at the federal government, but that's not actually where they started, right? And a lot of states, most major states already had state level accountability policies in place before we had No Child Left Behind. So what? So why should we care about discipline? Well, from a theoretical perspective, I think it matters that discipline has been centralized because it's really removing discipline from the center of education, right? Discipline used to be sort of one of the core reasons we sent kids to school, and that it was part of education, and now we see it as separate from, as a distraction from, and as kids who misbehave as not worthy of or not able to receive an education. They're almost considered ineducable. So I think it has this, it has theoretical underpinnings that actually affect what happens in schools. Materially, it's had an effect on a lot of different communities, but it especially has exacerbated a racial discipline gap. And even though we call it zero tolerance, which means you're not supposed to have tolerance for any kinds of misbehavior regardless of extenuating circumstances, when researchers study it, they actually see that these policies are still not implemented uniformly, right? So that, for instance, black children are much more likely to be suspended for vague behaviors like insubordination or using improper language, whereas in the suburbs, and white kids are much more likely to be suspended and expelled for more concrete behaviors like possessive drugs, right? So that even it's still not being uniformly applied. There's a lot of folks who are looking right now in schools. I draw on their research. I didn't conduct any of my own research on how zero tolerance happens in schools. But there's a lot of really good research out there on that. But then I also think sort of for people who study policy from a big perspective is to recognize that reform can happen from the bottom up, right? And that we can blame ourselves for a lot of the policies we have today that we want to blame Washington for, but they're actually our responsibility also. But the more optimistic flip to that is that we can undo those, right? That just as we pushed for centralization in discipline, but also in other levels of education, we can from the bottom push to undo them. But I think what happened in discipline, and actually what's happened in sort of the Common Core and other stuff, is that you need to have a real trust of your teachers, right? And one of the reasons why teachers in LA and then students and community members and principals push for rules from above is that they felt there wasn't this trust anymore, right? Teachers and students didn't trust each other. And I don't want to over-romanticize the past, right? Because the past has all sorts of other problems with it. But really, if you want to take more control over education policymaking, you've got to build that trust nearby, right? Because we'd be happy, right, to let teachers shut the door and teach how they want to teach if we trust them to teach well, right? And we'd be happy to let teachers make disciplinary decisions if we think they're going to make the right ones. Right? But if we think they're going to make the wrong ones, if we think they're going to show too much tolerance for misbehavior, that's when we want to put the policies above them. And that's my talk. I guess I can talk for 45 minutes without stopping. Questions, comments?
I know it's not really in the scope of your research, but do you think that the sort of bottom-up narrative might be inverted in places where there was segregation, as in like policy of segregation, where it was more centralized to begin with? Or did you find any research that would support that that kind of narrative is sort of more universal or applicable across students? I don't know if that's...
No, that's a great question, because desegregation is a huge part of the story. LA is a funny place because it had a lot of lawsuits, but it never desegregated. In sort of the regular old South, where you had, you know, the black high school and the white high school, and then they desegregated, there was an enormous push for centralized policies because there was fear of discrimination, right? So actually I should say it's two sides. This is always a story of two sides. On the one hand, you had black communities saying, we need centralized policies, and the Children's Defense Fund actually started out, this is one of the very first things they recommended, was centralized policies for greater equity. Right, because otherwise your black kids are getting suspended for stuff that white kids aren't getting suspended for. And we know that when these schools integrated, a lot of black teachers lost their jobs, black principals lost their jobs. You've got mostly white teachers and white principals making disciplinary decisions. So you've got black families saying, we want rules in place so that this discrimination can't happen. On the other side, you have white parents saying, black kids are going to get bused into our schools, it's going to be chaos, there's going to be violence, we want strict laws to make sure that anyone who misbehaves gets booted, right? We're not going to send our kids to school unless we know it's going to be lawful. So you actually did have that bottom-up narrative. The time frame's a little bit different. But yeah, you did have that, and I started out saying that I had looked at Detroit and Louisville. They basically had, in very different ways, kind of the story I just told from sort of two different perspectives and two different time periods, but basically that was the push for. And then the teachers were involved very much in Detroit. They saw it as a way to make their schools more secure by having strict policies.
So you touched a little bit on the teachers' union. I wonder what narrative, the teachers' union, the development of it, the union gaining more power, what narrative that played in this whole development of discipline? Yeah,
that's a great question. And this is a story that most people don't believe in, people who are very involved in Los Angeles Union, but the very first contract, so there was a lot of push to get rid of corporal punishment in Los Angeles, as in much of the country. And in Los Angeles, the school board did, after years and years and years of trying to get rid of corporal punishment, they finally passed a law getting rid of corporal punishment in the early 70s. And I'm going to have my year wrong. In the mid-70s, that's how long it took for the union in Los Angeles to get recognition and to be able to collectively bargain a contract. And when it did, one of the things they had in their contract was reinstituting corporal punishment. And so the school board, their speeches, they said, I can't believe that the union is holding us hostage, but we either don't give them a contract or we give them a contract with corporal punishment. And so LAUSD reinstated corporal punishment at the demand of the teachers union in the 1970s. So teachers continue to want sort of, I guess it's not really about centralization or not centralization, but it was definitely sort of pushing for district support of strict disciplinary action. They had a host of other sort of discipline-related stuff they wanted in their first contract. And actually, if you look at teacher union contracts, there's often discipline language in there, right? And it's often stated as job security issues, safety for teachers. And in the 70s, there were a lot of stories in the media about teachers being, attacked in their schools, and in particular, short white women being attacked by big black teenage boys in their inner city schools. So there was this sort of fear in the 70s in kind of urban schools all over. Other questions?
not quite sure how to phrase this, but is there anything you can comment in terms of enforcement? Like, it's one thing to have a zero tolerance drug policy, it's another thing to have drug dogs going around some schools and not others, or, you know, so you'll find things of that nature.
Metal, is that your metal detectors?
Metal
Is that what this
detectors,
was?
there
I
we
know
go,
the metal
that's what I was
detectors.
thinking of.
Yeah. Right. So I mean, so there's enforcement and there's also equity issues,
Right.
right? So enforcement is still up to localities, and in fact, most zero tolerance policies stay somewhere in there, ultimately at the discretion of the authorizing agency. So ultimately, someone's supposed to have discretion. Maybe not the principal, but maybe it's at the board level or maybe it's at the county level, kind of depending on who's in charge of those schools, right? And you mostly hear, in fact, I was on NBC Nightly News a year and a half ago, you mostly hear about stories in the media when it's a white kid in the suburbs, right? And that's why I was at some girl, a white girl in the suburbs had some, like, a leave or something in her locker and got suspended, or expelled, I can't remember. But that's usually the stories we hear are sort of these egregious stories, right? And they say, oh, we have no discretion. It's not our fault, we have no discretion. But what we find is actually, of course, we can only follow what's documented, right? So when there's instances where the principal says, I'm going to look the other way, I'm going to mark this as an altercation and not a fight, then we don't know about them, right? Unless you've got a researcher who happens to be in there. So, but we have fairly good evidence that in fact, even though they're supposed to be uniform, they're not enacted uniformly, right? And your examples with sort of some schools in the same district will have metal detectors and some won't, is not against zero tolerance policy, right? But we see that it's an uneven enactment, right? So in New York, schools that are seen as more dangerous, that tend to have more students of color, it's very difficult for students to keep their cell phones on them, right? Because there's metal detectors every day. Other schools don't have metal detectors every day. Those kids who tend to be more affluent keep their cell phones on them every day, right? So we see there's this unequal effect, even though it's supposed to be uniform. And I can't think of an instance where that unequal effect harms white affluent kids more than poor kids of color, right? It always sort of goes the other way. I don't know if that gets at your question.
Yeah, it does.
You gave examples of problems cropping up with the centralized policies, but noted several times that the teachers and the principals made no effort to relocate the power back to themselves in the local environment, instead preferring to harden the policies. Why do you think that was?
Right, great question. I mean, I think it's, again, because they weren't so confident that they wanted that authority, right? With great authority comes great responsibility, right? So I think that they wanted to be, they would often use words like protection, right? And they tended to teachers tended to couch their arguments in terms of professional responsibility, right? I am a hired social studies teacher. I know a lot about social studies. I really don't know much about self-defense, or I don't know much about peer mediation, or I don't, I'm here to teach my subject. I'm not here to deal with these extreme discipline problems. So they want the policy to sort of take care of the problems that they don't want to deal with. And I was a teacher. I'm not trying to, and this is not meant to be teacher bashing, right? I mean, I just think that we also need to own sort of where we are in this process, right? So, and I also don't want to romanticize back in the olden days when teachers could just randomly expel somebody, right? Or they could just say, look, don't come back here anymore, right? So teachers had maybe more discretion than they should have had. And certainly a lot of push in, especially minority communities or Black and brown, but mostly Black communities, for centralized policy was as protection from discrimination, right? So this autonomy can be used for good and for bad. But I think for teachers, they didn't want the responsibility that came with all that autonomy. And perhaps they never did want it, but this was the point historically where they found a way to relieve themselves of some of it.
Things have become so complex that the court cases and things like that.
Yeah, but again, this stuff started before the court cases, and I think, I have 2 kids in kindergarten, and I'm on sabbatical this year, so I've been able to go in their classrooms a little bit and volunteer and stuff, and I think it's not that complex, right? Sort of what's happening in their classrooms and what's happening in their schools isn't, again, that different, right? From certainly when I went to kindergarten, or probably when my mom went to kindergarten. But there's a different set of expectations in the building now, because again, we've got that huge thing of regulations, right? Even though my kids can't write, they were supposed to sign this thing that they understood all their roles and responsibilities, and they understood the penalties for being disobedient and all that, right? So my kids are young, 4 and a half, they're supposed to sign these things. So we've got that level of regulation over them. But what's actually happening in the classroom, I don't think it's too complicated.
Thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much, Judith.